I have been thinking about this subject a lot recently, how there are so many types of stories that I feel use certain attributes of Superman as a character, but in their own way or through their own lens, unintentional or not. I felt that it was an interesting thing to talk about, even outside of the very obvious one I'll get into soon, because I was thinking about these stories and I feel that Superman is really embedded into these stories from either a physical point of view or a moral point of view. And I just wanted to talk about them because I feel like talking about the character of Superman and what he stands for is really important in this day and age. So with that, let's get started. Now, the first one to really get into is the Iron Giant. Now, it's no surprise that this is the first one of the three because many have already stated how much this is a Superman story with not only its frequent references to the character, but in its concept. Alien being falls to Earth only to be adopted by humanity to become a hero. Conceptually, it has more to do with Superman than, ironically, the original Ted Hughes story, The Iron Man. However, this wasn't Brad Bird's intention at all, as the original idea for the film is much more heartbreaking. In 1989, Bird's sister Susan was shot and killed by her husband, who eventually turned the gun on himself. Many years after this traumatic experience, he would go on to read the Iron Man novel, while in the film's very early stages, connecting with the themes of the book. With this, he developed the main pitch for the film, which was, what if a gun had a soul and didn't want to be a gun? Hence why Giant says later on in the film,
I am not a gun,
after rescuing two boys who fall off a building. So while it was not totally Bird's intention for it to become a Superman story, it is essentially that, not just from the basic concept, but going back to the pitch. What if a gun had a soul? I mean, isn't that essentially what Superman is? He is a living weapon, with powers that are often compared to gods, and yet he remains the kindest, most giving, and most altruistic person on Earth. And on top of that, with the gigantic influx of evil Superman stories in the wake of Injustice, we know what happens with power when used without a soul. The Iron Giant is the most all-encompassing out of the three Superman stories I will talk about because it feels like it nails everything in regards to the character, but in its own way. Giant is our Superman parallel, obviously. When he comes down to Earth, whether it be because he escaped his tyrannical planet or because he was sent here, he loses his memory due to the bump on his head, putting him into a metaphorical infantile state rather than a literal one to that of Superman. It is through humanity that our alien with unimaginable power learns to become good. In Iron Giant, it's through Hogarth, while in the Superman mythos, it's John and Martha Kent, with a slight edge to Lois Lane as well, depending on the version. Kent Mansley is the villain of the piece, and while he doesn't really have much of a parallel, you could compare him to Lex Luthor, trying to take down Giant because he believes that he can't be this good when we don't know where he came from or what he really is or what he can do. However, the personality more so matches the Silver Age Lex Luthor, who steals 40 cakes rather than the cold calculating chess player that we know of today. I feel like Annie and Dean are simply an extension of Hogarth in terms of the good parts of humanity, while not having anything specific to compare to. As well as the small town in Maine, named Rockwell, having some parallels to Smallville, and the General being somewhat similar to Sam Lane, who can be good or bad depending on the story or the situation. I mean, the movie's
"You are what you choose to be"
motto straight up sounds like advice given to Clark by John Kent. I mean, compare it to one of the teaser trailers for Man of Steel.
You have to decide what kind of man you want to grow up to be. Whoever that man is, good character or bad, he's going to change the world.
I mean, come on, isn't that just a long-winded way of saying you are who you choose to be? Kind of like how the big speech in The Amazing Spider-Man from Uncle Ben was essentially, with great power comes great responsibility, but they didn't want to repeat that line, so they had to circumvent around it to sound more original for some reason, but that's beside the point. The Iron Giant is said to be the best Superman film we have ever gotten, and I am inclined to agree. With its themes, characters, concept, and overall story, it's no secret that it is very clear-cut on what it becomes, despite not being what it set out to be. Now, if we can actually get Brad Bird to direct a Superman film, that would be great. Maybe it could be that new reboot that's coming. Fuck me in the dick hole. Alright, let's move on before this becomes a DCU rant. Now for our second and third Superman stories. These might be a bit weird, but stay with me. When I was talking about the second story with a friend, the more I talked about it, the more I realized that, yeah, it essentially is a Superman story. And with that, my second non-Superman Superman story is the Doctor Who story, The Caves of Androzani. As I said, bit weird. So for the people that don't know, this is a story about the Doctor and his companion Perry Brown going to a planet called Androzani Minor, where they get embroiled in a plot between a corporation trying to mine a certain drug for Androzani Major, while the militants hired by the corporation try to stop a terrorist from stopping the operation, as well as many betrayals, backstabs, and twists, showcasing the absolute worst of people. It is essentially a wrong place, wrong time situation. Now, if you are unfamiliar with classic Doctor Who, here's a quick rundown of this characterization of this version of the Doctor. Played by Peter Davison, he is the fifth incarnation of the character, and this one was quite different from his other portrayals. He was kinder, less sarcastic, less grumpy, and had a wistful spring in his step as opposed to the other actors that had played the character thus far. He is what many considered to be the most heroic and beneficent of the classic Doctors, as his next incarnation was an asshole, and the one after that was a Machiavellian chess player that threaded the line between good and evil. So this Doctor already had a good streak and deeply cared for others, and tried to help whenever possible, and a certain feckless charm described by his next incarnation. So with all this, I know for a fact that The Caves of Androzani is a Superman story because of many reasons I will state here, but also one major reason I will talk about towards the end. Literally everything is against the odds for the Doctor and Perry in this story. Nobody is on their side at all, whether it be a greedy corporation, a terrorist bent on taking them down, and a general playing both sides. It doesn't help that earlier on, both the Doctor and Perry get infected with the raw, non-synthesized version of the drug, which can kill. So now it's also a race against time, with the Doctor and Perry trying to get a cure and everyone getting in their way. The Doctor and Perry get separated at some point in the story, and despite the odds not being in his favor, he goes through pretty much everything imaginable to save her, not only from the planet itself, but from the toxin, despite the fact that in the then canon, he only just met her in the previous story. So even though that he's dying, them getting separated, the antitoxin being virtually impossible to get, a giant magma beast essentially guarding where the antitoxin is, a terrorist who wants Perry as his pet, a military who wants them dead, and eventually an entire planet crumbling around them, the Doctor still goes to absolute lengths to save someone he barely knows, even going so far to delay his regeneration and crashing a spaceship into the planet while having a gun pointed at his head and not being fazed by it at all.
No, my slip hands in the air over here. Why? Because I'll kill you if you don't.
Not a very persuasive argument, actually, Stubbs, because I'm going to die soon anyway. Unless, of course,
I'll give it to a count of three.
Unless, of course, I can find the antidote. I owe it to my friend to try because I got her into this. So you see, I'm not going to let you stop me now.
In the very last moments of the final episode, he actually drops one of the vials of antitoxin, and even though he doesn't know if he will regenerate and could die permanently, he still gives the antitoxin to Perry because he knows that he needs to save her so that not everything he did will be for nothing. This is the story of an alien going against all odds to save a girl he barely knows, despite knowing that he could die permanently. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. That describes Caves of Androzani to a T. That, to me, makes it a Superman story. However, the reason I know it is almost fact, because that is also, note for note, the premise of the 2019 Superman story, Superman Up in the Sky. It involves a little girl getting kidnapped by someone who's only described as a spaceman, and despite space being infinite and literally impossible to find one little girl across said infinite space, Superman does it anyway. Why? Because he's Superman. That's why. While I do hate to give Tom King writing for DC any credit, it just confirms that Caves of Androzani is a Superman story because it is the Doctor being the physical embodiment of what it means to be Superman, what he really is, what he can achieve, and what he feels he has to do. However, I would not describe the Doctor as a hero, as he's much more complicated than that and not as cut and dry as that. Because he can do something as heroic as this, but then blow up Skaro like it was nothing. But many have stated that in this case, this is the Doctor being the most selfless and most heroic, and it is because of that that I feel he does embody Superman. The Up in the Sky story just pretty much proves that. Then, my final story that I think embodies the character of Superman, more from a moral standpoint rather than a physical standpoint of the previous story, is 12 Angry Men. I had decided to rewatch this a while back, and while I was watching it, I really began to realize how the juror, played by Henry Fonda, really does represent Superman from a moral point of view. The reason I say this is because from the get-go, Fonda's character doesn't claim to be an expert. He doesn't claim to be the smartest person in the room. He doesn't claim anything. He just has doubt on whether this kid really killed his father. He just says, I don't know, having that reasonable doubt, having a bad feeling in his gut and acting upon that. I think that is a very Superman thing to do in terms of a moral stance. He could have said nothing, or acted like an asshole going in half-cocked and trying to be the smartest person in the room. I know people are watching this and calling bullshit. Doing the right thing doesn't automatically make you Superman. Well, here's the thing though. What are the two things that Superman fights for? Truth and justice. And that certainly applies here. And probably the greatest argument is that he manages to inspire an entire group of people, whether that be someone who is more willing to believe it, like Joseph Sweeney's character, or someone who is thoroughly against the idea of a not guilty verdict, whether that be Lee Cobb's character or E.G. Marshall's character, to go the other way. He doesn't slip over his words or stutter or act out of place. He stays cool and level-headed, but still feels so human. Which is what people forget Superman can be, or really essentially is. Superman doesn't see himself as Superman or a Superman. He sees himself as Clark Kent.
Lois, Superman is what I can do. Clark is who I am.
A man who was gifted these abilities and tries to do good as best he can. He sees himself as human because he was raised by humans. He's a guy trying to do the right thing in a certain way, and that's what Fonda is doing here. A guy trying to do the right thing because he sees the whole situation for what it is and what it could be. A kid who never had a chance, who people see as a delinquent, a nobody, someone who'll never amount to anything. But Fonda takes all that out and just sees a person who needs help. In this very moment, he has so much power in the palm of his hands, much like Superman. It might not be X-ray vision or laser eyes, but he has a human life in the palm of his hands, and he knows he has to do something. With the power of his words and the hope of trying to do good, he manages to inspire an entire group of people with differing personalities from all walks of life and stand up and say, hang on, this is not right. This isn't okay. And make them think otherwise, showing the value of this one life, and especially of someone who's just a kid, who has his entire life ahead of him. Many people see a guy with all this power and just shoo him off as, he's not relatable. But the fact that I see Superman more in Henry Fonda's performance than I do in Zack Snyder's interpretation proves that he is. Because the basis of the character is just a guy trying to do the right thing, which is what Fonda does so terrifically in his magnificent performance. The people who claim that he isn't just see a guy with a lot of cool powers when Superman is so much more than that. He is a friend who sees the goodness in people, in everybody. And I think that basis makes 12 Angry Men a Superman story, because it is the story of a regular guy realizing that he cannot in good conscience send a kid to death that easily, but also doesn't act like he's the smartest person in the room or knows everything, just that he wants to reevaluate. And with the power of his values, he manages to do so. He manages to, with the amount of evidence they have, instill reasonable doubt. Not that he didn't do it, just enough doubt to not write him off that easily. Remember, there is a reason that the terms in the justice system are guilty and not guilty. Not, however, guilty and innocent. And that makes juror number 8 Superman to me. The hope he has in this kid, the inspiration to change the mindset of 11 other individuals, knowing the power he has in the palm of his hands and using it properly and wanting to save this life because he knows he can in this instance.
Philosophically, what does Superman represent to people?
A friend, and that's what people really need most. They don't need a strong arm, one-man vigilante force. They need a friend. We're living in an age when people are basically afraid of contact with each other. They're afraid. People live in cities. They don't even know their neighbors. They're afraid to go out in the street. Something might happen to them. Basically, technology is against you. Life is overwhelming. Even the bank doesn't know who you are. And it's like, we run around scared a lot, particularly those of us who live in cities. And America was founded on the virtues of a helping hand, of going 5 miles to lend your neighbor a donkey or whatever he needed. And I think that is that kind of virtue that's at the bottom. That's the heart of Superman. The genuine love of people, and that you always know he's your friend.
And with that clip, I end it here. While the Iron Giant is seen as the most obvious one, and everyone can pretty much universally agree that it is a Superman story, I hope that with my other 2 choices, you see that there is something to be seen with The Caves of Androzani and 12 Angry Men. Go back and take a look at these movies, or maybe it can inspire you to read more of the character. But I think these stories show how important Superman can be when done correctly, and not necessarily be hampered by restrictions of actually doing an adaptation of the character. Because remember, especially in this cynical day and age, and I'm not exactly innocent either, Superman is everywhere. We might forget, we might not see it, but he's out there. He might even be the person looking back at you in the mirror. Have a good day, guys.